Upstream listeners, registration for the Colson Center National Conference ends in just a few days on May 3rd. I hope you can join me and speakers like Stephen Meyer, Justin Bailey, and Kristen Collier as we encounter God in His mighty works. Register by May 3rd at colsonconference.org. Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with my Colson Center colleague, Tim Padgett, to talk more about my conversation with Austin Freeman. That was about his book, Tolkien Dogmatics, Theology with the Maker of Middle-earth. Thanks for joining me, Tim.
Sure thing. Glad to be able to join again after, I guess last week we talked, but it's been a while since we had a good long conversation.
So I have to ask this at the outset. What did your first exposure to Tolkien look like? What was it that drew you in? When did you first experience the magic?
My first memory of Tolkien was, remember, I'm a bit older than you, this would have been 1977 or 78, watching the old cartoon of The Hobbit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's really old and it's very...
So the Hobbits, yeah. That's a really distinctive looking one. We're not talking about the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings adaptation, which is a different thing, right?
Yeah, I think it might be the same studio.
Okay.
A lot of the same vibe. It's interesting. If it's on Amazon Prime, if anybody wants to go check that out. I mean, I think you got to buy it or rent it. But it's interesting. It leaves out a lot. It leaves out Bjorn, which is one of my favorite parts.
How can you leave out Bjorn?
Yeah, and I mean, they leave out a lot. But that was my first exposure. There was the movie. I remember distinctly. We didn't have a TV growing up. My parents were concerned about watching what was going to be on there. So we would rent a TV, or my dad would even take the TV into work with him during the week. But this was one of the times where we had a TV and it was going to be on. It was on live. You could only watch it when it was being broadcast. It wasn't. This is even before VHS. And it's very 70s. They leave out a lot. It's fun. I mean, kids would like it. You and Austin and people like me, we're going to groan because we know how much they're leaving out. But that was probably my first one. Also, there was an accompanying picture book that came along with it. And I still have that. It's in my house here 40-something years later. It's still in my house. And I just remember the very vivid colors and the stories. And it just shows that the core of the story, even if you don't get into the high-level stuff that you and Austin were talking about, it is still an enjoyable thing for little kids. It's one of those beauties of Tolkien's work, is that children can enjoy it and adults can have long conversations about it.
Tolkien stuff is so iconic, not just on a literary level, but on an artistic level, partly because he himself did a lot of artwork. So some of the look of things was established. I think he did a drawing of Minas Tirith, so it always kind of looks the same. He did a drawing of the one of the Hobbit holes, so you get a pretty consistent picture of what Bag End at least looks like, with the round door and the knob and so forth. And then he did obviously a lot of more stylized stuff for the original, I think, editions of the book. So he was an artist. He could paint, he could draw. It's very impressive what he did. And then he did those maps, those famous maps, like at the front of The Hobbit, you see Smaug, and he's kind of spiraled around the Lonely Mountain, and all the different features of that section of Middle-earth for that story. And then beyond Tolkien himself, you've got this artistic canon that develops with the cartoons. And I don't know exactly what his reaction was to those. I don't know which ones he lived to see and didn't. But obviously he's, that his work is being translated artistically into that. And then the more serious stuff that comes along a bit later. And the two artists I'm thinking of here are Alan Lee and John Howe. And these guys established this just unbelievable, like mind-blowing artistic canon for Tolkien that's mostly paintings and sketches. And what's really cool is that, and many people will have been first exposed to The Lord of the Rings through the Peter Jackson movies. That's when I guess the thing it went from a subculture to truly mainstream and global. But those movies, the visual language that those movies use is drawn from those two artists. So it's very consistent. Like if you've seen Orthanc, the tower that Saruman lives in, the White Wizard, if you've seen that tower in Alan Lee's artwork, you see it in Peter Jackson's movie. It's like the same kind of thing. You've seen the that famous picture that John Howe did of Gandalf, and he's kind of like hurrying through the Shire with his walking stick and he looking very gray pilgrim, with the pointed hat and everything. And there's a light drizzle coming down and everything's green. It looks like the Irish countryside. That virtually makes it into the movie. Iconographically, if I can coin a term. So yeah, a lot of this stuff it sticks in the imagination, not just because Tolkien is an excellent writer, but because he's been well visualized so many times. And even for all the criticisms that I might have of the storytelling and characterization of the Amazon Rings of Power series, the one thing you can say about them is that they're very beautiful. They've got a really nice visual language going on there as well. So yeah, I mean, and we're nerding out already, of course, but this is part of the joy of celebrating Tolkien, and part of why as soon as you begin talking about theology, a lot of people's eyes glaze over. But when you start talking about theology through the lens of Tolkien and Middle Earth, all of a sudden people are really interested in it. And this because they've fallen in love with this story and its beauty on every level.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. I think I emailed you that you Casey and I, we're all going to be at the Colson conference here in a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks, right? And I'm sure that one of these evenings we will probably sit down with a beverage and nerd out on this or Dune or something like that. There is just so much there. One of the books of The Hobbit that I have it's a large one. It's the annotated version of The Hobbit. And not only does it have all the cool notes and stuff like that to kind of explain, but it has the illustrations from all the different versions.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's really kind of cool because it'll have the Slovak version, it'll have the Russian version, and going back to the 50s, and I guess the 60s and whatnot. And you can see how each culture brings its own little spin on what each of them look like. Like the Japanese one, you can look at that, and if you've seen anime, you can see that there's a beauty in that. My favorite story about the Tolkien's reaction to popular representation is that apparently the Beatles wanted to do the movie, and they were going to be the Fellowship.
Oh no!
And they were going to be Frodo and whatnot. And Tolkien apparently had lived down the street from them. This is a story I've heard. I mean, I've seen it a couple of times. He'd lived down the street from them and despised them, and so refused to allow them to do it. And I just love that. It's just amusing.
Oh man, can you just imagine it? It comes in pints. I'm getting one.
Oh my god, it would be the Animaniacs meets the Hobbit.
Yeah, wow. Thank God that didn't happen. There were some weird things. There was this radio adaptation that it was a kind of a semi-dramatization reading. They abridged it a little bit. I don't even remember who did that, but I was given that in this this kind of stylized wood case with a bunch of CDs, and it was the whole Lord of the Rings on audio CDs. And so they added music and sound effects and stuff, but it was very, I guess not, it was 60s or 70s. It sounded like it. It really sounded like it. I mean, when Gandalf would cast a spell, it was like this laser noise you'd hear in Star Trek or something. It was that was back when sci-fi and fantasy kind of blended in many people's minds.
I've only seen clips, but there's the infamous Soviet, not Russian, but Soviet version of it, which is I think they did Lord of the Rings, and it's awful.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, their nuclear power projects were pretty bad too, and the maintenance on their submarines and all that stuff.
Right.
So, Tim, one of the things that I know caught your attention about the conversation, and that I've talked with people since, and it's just really amazed them, is what Austin said about the field of Tolkien studies and then the fandom, how there's this settled consensus among Tolkien people that it's possible and even appropriate to just analyze him on the level of fantasy and fiction and separate that from his religious convictions. And in fact, what Austin said was that discussion of Tolkien's religious ideas and the significance of those ideas for his fiction, it's not even allowed on this big main Tolkien Facebook page, which is mind-boggling to me. It would have been mind-boggling to me before I read his book. But now that I've read all of the evidence he marshals, that J.R.R. Tolkien was deeply committed to writing a deeply Christian story, and that he was convinced that his worldview came through in his legends. It convinces me that he would look at this effort to prize apart his imaginative work from his faith with just bewilderment and disgust. Like he wouldn't understand what these people were trying to do because he really did believe. And there were several statements to the effect that no one is going to understand my stories if they don't understand who I am as a Christian, as an English romantic, as a philologist, all of these aspects of his life. And as he said, the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally Catholic story in the end. And, that sort of thing puzzles a lot of fans. I told the story about the friend I talked to who was just like, oh yeah, the Lord of the Rings is, it's this parable for various political things, possibly for World War II or something. But ultimately it's not a theological undertaking. It doesn't have religious truth at its heart. But when we have it from the horse's mouth, it really does have religious truth at the heart of it. And there was a time when I didn't quite see that or understand how that could be true. But I certainly see it now.
When I heard you talking about that, I found that it's almost like the quintessential postmodern moment. I mean, literally, not just we live in an era past modernism, but in like a literary sense of that, there's no meaning in the text. There's nothing behind the text kind of thing, where people who are enjoying this wonderful work of art, and they're legitimately enjoying it. It's not like they're not enjoying it. It's not like they're making it entirely different, but they think that it can be wholly divorced from the author. And there's this separate, where they're creating their own version of it. And it's this, I think there's a couple of things going on. There's the postmodern thing of, there's no meaning in this text kind of thing, where they're trying to say that you can ignore the theological background, all the things that he's drawing on, all these myths and whatnot that he's drawing on, and these infusions of Christian truth. I loved a bit with your conversation with Austin about where this would fit in a legitimate historical chronology, the Age of the Heroes kind of thing. He's drawing on all those sorts of things. I think there's also a bit of a modernist critique going on with that, in that more with your friend than what Austin was talking about, in the idea that religion is just a hobby. Religion is just a little segment of life. It's like someone being a baseball fan or someone being a Lord of the Rings fan, for that matter. That it's just a little hobby that they have, that they're doing, but it doesn't really affect the core of life. Whereas for Tolkien, I mean, sometimes his Roman Catholicism, you and I as Protestants were like, cool down, cool your jets there. We can all be friends now. That really informs so much of what he does. And that's one of the things I loved about Austin's book. He takes him seriously. I mean, Austin is reformed, and he's engaging with his Roman Catholic in a very respectful way, not pretending there's not any difference, but also noting the differences, and dealing with it very respectfully, and helping to understand where Tolkien was coming from, how he's drawing these images of Mary and images of relics and images of saints and all that sort of stuff that is even alien to you and I, let alone to seculars. But yeah, you see all those things going on. It is really a postmodern attempt to only take it what you want it to be. It was a fascinating element of that.
Yeah, Austin talks about how it's sort of surprising that Tolkien, as a Roman Catholic, wrote a story in which there is very little to no ritualized religion. So there is the true God. People know that the true God exists and that he made the world. He's openly acknowledged at several points, much more as you go back into the historical accounts of the first age and the second age and so forth. By the third age, there's not a lot of open acknowledgement. But, Catholicism is full of this very liturgical, ritual acknowledgement of and worship of God. Tolkien doesn't have that in his world. And I think that cues us into something about what he's doing. So the mistake I made years ago, ironically, it was very similar to the mistake that a lot of these secular fans of Tolkien who want to separate his religion from his fiction make. And that is looking for the elements of the Apostles' Creed in Tolkien. In other words, saying, okay, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead and buried. Okay, we've got this going on. This is Christianity. And now we look at Middle Earth and ask, well, how much of that is going on there? And you can pretty legitimately say, not much of it. I mean, there's an almighty creator, and then the rest of it's not there. And so the mistake is to conclude that therefore Tolkien's work is not essentially Christian. But that's a misunderstanding about how you would write a story in an imagined world that fits Christianity hand in glove without actually parroting the central redemptive message of Christianity. And part of the reason for that is that, as Tolkien makes clear, and this isn't always clear to a lot of his readers, he is writing an imaginative story about the ancient history of our world, that Middle Earth is this world, Arda is this universe, that this is prior to the incarnation of Christ. And so it's even prior to the call of Abraham. And that's sort of his idea. So it's antediluvian partly, but then you have a sort of flood parallel, and it moves into a more post-flood ancient world. But all of it's before God begins to reveal himself specially to a particular people. And that, of course, Tolkien doesn't think any of this actually happened in that way. What he's saying is that the real story of the real world has a time before Christianity. It has a time before the revelation of the gospel proper and of the incarnation of Christ. So what would the age of heroes look like in such a world? What would it look like if we took all the great Anglo-Saxon and Germanic myths and a smattering of other sort of myths and ideas, the saga, the Volsungs, and the Beowulf kind of stuff, and
the Finns,
yeah, right, and blended all this together, the stuff that Tolkien really loved, and then Christianized it in a way that situated it in the real world as he saw it. And that's sort of the answer to the question that it is possible to have a story that's deeply Christian and also does not sort of parallel the planks of the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And that didn't compute for me years ago, but it computes for me now. I've always loved The Lord of the Rings, but I wasn't always sure. I kind of thought people who wanted to see Christian parallels in everything in the story were they were reaching. I mean, it was sort of a stretch. I'm sure there have been some stretches. There have been some books that carry a little too far, but yeah, it's undeniable. The author himself thought this, and he designed it that way. And what you were saying a second ago about people trying to separate the author from the work, I saw this heard this rather, so clearly in Megan Phelps Roper's podcast series, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. So you have the same kind of thing now going on with J.K. Rowling, who's still alive and can still speak for herself, right? She can still say, no, that's not what my work means. It means this. But, there's this whole fandom that now is trying to sort of cut her out of the picture and say, well, this is ours. We own this. There is no authorial intent. There is only my reading of the text. And to me, Harry Potter is a story about how people can be whatever they want, including transgender. And and Rowling saying, no, that's not what I meant. It's an interesting parallel. I'm not sort of placing her on level with Tolkien as a thinker, a writer, although I do very much enjoy Harry Potter. And she, as an article I read recently pointed out, I think it was Samuel James, he wrote this at Gospel Coalition, that J.K. Rowling made her own bed. I mean, she created the monster that's currently coming after her because she was very happy to be the woke Twitter queen for a long time. But, Tolkien wasn't that kind of person. He strikes me as an exceptionally private person in a lot of ways, even much less charismatic and sort of outgoing and outspoken than C.S. Lewis. And yet he exerted this enormous influence on Lewis. So, yeah, I find it fascinating as a figure. I need to read more biography as well.
Yeah, I actually, for a conference that I did, oddly enough, with Austin Freeman this past fall, I read several biographies of Tolkien, and he was a very, very interesting guy, quirky guy. You can see some of his insistence on Roman Catholicism in his upbringing, because as I believe you guys discussed, or maybe it was in the book, that his mother passes, is sick and dies. And in the midst of her extended family rejecting her because she converted to Roman Catholicism. And that became this key thing in Tolkien's personality. And to try and say that doesn't play a role would be silly. And the irony of these postmodern critics is no one wants to be treated that way themselves. If you ever tweet, some of these Harry Potter tweeters tweet something out and you take them out of context, they will tell you very quickly. I mean, no one, for all the postmodern stuff about there's no meaning in the text, there's no meaning in your text, but there sure is in mine. And that tends to be the way things go. I remember seeing a thing about even Gandalf himself, Ian McKellen. He commented on the fact that there's no religion. One of the things he loves is that there's no religion in Hobbiton. There's no church. There's nothing like that. And we understand, given his lifestyle, why that appeals to him. But someone who could so well capture, I mean, here's the question. Does he capture it so well? Or is he such a good actor that we now see Gandalf as Ian McKellen? There's a question for you.
That was something that troubled my dad when I remember the conversation when I told him this. I was like, hey, because he had never read The Lord of the Rings, and then he watched the Peter Jackson movies, and he was just so awed and moved by the whole thing. I mean, he saw immediately the clear spiritual resonances. And I remember telling him, hey, Dad, the guy who plays Gandalf is actually like outspokenly gay. And he was like, there's no way. I just refuse to believe that. That can't possibly be true. Eventually, he came to see that that's the truth. But yeah, Ian McKellen is a marvelous actor, and that's where it comes through. But as for Hobbiton or the Shire having no religion, Tolkien's own faith not coming through in his work, I guess I just have to tell Ian McKellen, throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity.
Shane, if this podcast thing doesn't work out, you could do some voiceover work. You're good at accent.
Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah, I think there's a lot there, and you do see. I mean, I thought that Austin's book and your conversation really brought out how much of the angelology sorts of things that the Tolkien was working on here. And I love his suggestion that the key book for this, for understanding the medieval mind, is The Discarded Image. And those of you who have not read it, it's not the typical easy C.S. Lewis book. Though I was telling that to a friend of mine who has a very sharp family. Both the parents are mathematicians. They've got like 6 or 7 kids, and they're all off the charts genius. And I mentioned that this was The Discarded Image. It's a bit of a hard slog. And I was about to say it was really difficult. He said, yeah, my 10-year-old, she just read that. And it's one of those families that they're just brilliant and you love them and they don't know how smart they are. They're wonderful. But you see so much of the angelology. And something I put in my notes here is you see a resonance of this in a lot of sci-fi stuff. To show more of my nerd card here, 2 of my favorite sci-fi shows was Babylon 5 and Stargate from the 90s and into the early 2000s. And both of them play with this a little bit. Babylon 5 is set about 250 years off in the future. And in the storyline, there are these aliens who have visited Earth in the past. And they're explicit about the fact that they show, at least the good guys, these guys are the Vorlons, and they're basically like angels. And when they show up to humans, they look like our version of angels. When they show up to another alien race, they look like their equivalent of angels or something like that. And the same with the shadows, the bad guys, and they're basically these demonic people. Everything did you think of angels and demons? And they're playing with these images and whatnot. And interestingly, in that series, if you watch the series, the creator is very clearly drawing on Tolkien for a lot of his creations. And then the other one of Stargate, there's the same sort of thing where these aliens are coming in and personifying or either taking on or creating these myths. And it's the whole Chariot of the Gods sort of thing, that the ancient myths that we all have are really memories, stories handed down of interactions with angels. And it's interesting that it's a common thing. And what Tolkien has done here is he's done a similar thing, except kept his a little Orthodox Christianity in tow. And he's done this in a way that could explain how all the angelology, all the stories and myths being handed down for years, centuries and millennia, that they could have an origin in something real. And it makes it a plausible thing. And that's kind of the interesting thing is he's made, instead of taking history and making it fantastical, he's taken fantasy stories and put skin on them, made them historical feeling. You feel that Aragorn could have been a real hero. You feel that magic and all these various things, they could be real. And that's something that I think that's one of the beautiful things about it. Again, instead of he does what the Bible does. In so much he's telling the story as a real story. Now, of course, with the Bible, it's a real thing. And with Tolkien, he's clearly playing with fantasy, though he's speculating as to what element of that could be real. And I think that's what is so appealing about it.
Yeah, and I agree with Austin too. He says this at a couple points in the book and suggested something in this direction in our conversation. But that if you'd asked Tolkien, do you really think that something like the Valar exist. So the Valar are the kind of ruling angels in the physical world, and they've chosen to enter it after the vision of creation unfolded in the music, and they're going to bring that into maturity and then govern it. And that's what happens. So they're kind of like the top dogs. They're not all the angels, but they're the ones that came down into Earth. If you asked him, do you think something like that exists? That there's really, a Manwë and a Varda and an Aule and all these figures? I think he'd say yes, and that's what Austin believes as well. That Tolkien probably does believe in something like, we talked about the Divine Council, these immediate ruling spirits, or what he called the Middle Heaven or the Middle Heavens. I love that way of putting it, because we really have gutted that in a sense in our popular piety, where we'll talk about God and we'll talk about angels, but usually they're as sort of just mediators or messengers, which, to be fair, that's what the word angel means. That's where the Greek root is messenger. So it's fine to think of angels that way because that's a role they play, but that's not all they do. And there are, as Michael Heiser goes into in several of his books, there are tantalizing hints in Scripture that there is a lot more going on. Now, as Calvin talks about in the Institutes, when he actually it's in his chapter on angels, which I've just found endlessly fascinating. But he talks about how we're given as much about angels as we need to know for our salvation and welfare. We're not told their story. In other words, we're told as much as we need to know in order to be comforted by their presence, aware of those that are not on God's side, that are our enemies, and then responsive to their work in our lives. But we don't need to know any more than that. Well, Tolkien is kind of speculating on a deeper mythology or history of what that middle heaven could have looked like, what could have been going on in the distant past, in the age of legends, as Robert Jordan would call it, or dream time, as the Australian natives would call it, or the time of heroes, as the Greek or Mediterranean cultures might refer to it. It really is that, and that's a recurring theme throughout cultures in the world. There was a time when gods walked among men, when the animals could talk, when magic was real. Lewis plays with this when Merlin comes back in That Hideous Strength. It's like he's from an age when the age of Arthurian legend, which he says was itself at the tail end of the time of magic. That was just about done at that point. Well, the fun part about the Third Age and the Lord of the Rings is, well, I guess you could say that it's the sad part about it, but it's fun to imagine that because it connects it with our world, is that the War of the Ring, the defeat of Sauron, is the transition from the age of magic to the age of men. And that's why the elves leave. They go to heaven, basically. They leave the shores of Middle-earth, most of them. That's why all the magic begins to fade with the destruction of the ring, because it was all caught up and bound up with the power of the ring. Like Galadriel's ring and Gandalf's ring and Elrond's ring, they're not going to work anymore because the One Ring was like the linchpin of the whole thing. So there's a fading. That's a constant theme throughout Tolkien. Fading, because we're leaving that age and we're going into the age of men. And Aragorn is like the first human king of the new age, because I guess the destruction of the ring or the coronation of Aragorn, I forget which one, is the beginning of the fourth age of that world, which is it's so cool. And obviously we're so deep in nerd territory right now that it's absurd, and some people are going to be just like rolling their eyes, but it's really fun and beautiful to lose ourselves in Tolkien's work, because he is someone you can trust in many ways. And this is what it brings up the next thing I wanted to talk about, which endlessly fascinates me. Maybe you could shed some light on it, because I'm a little bit puzzled, and you've just read some Tolkien biographies. Why is it that Tolkien himself seems to be driven by something other than the need to publish or the need to share his stuff? It almost seems as if he's driven by this compulsion to create and write and make myth without giving a second thought to whether anyone else is going to read it or whether he's going to sell it. And then people like Lewis come into his life and go, hey, you should write something that's ready for publication, and then put it out there for the world, because the rest of the people need this. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the whole contrast between Lewis and Tolkien in terms of their writing style is just endlessly fascinating. It's one of those, opposites attract situations. I mean, there's social media memes about it that has the one person like Tolkien saying, "I'm going to make the most crafted world imaginable," and then the other one is Danny DeVito says, "Well, then I just started writing," and it's Lewis there. So the first one, Tolkien.
Or I will lose my mind if even one single person reads this and does not know that the big lion is Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. And the fact that Lewis could write some of the Narnia stories in just a few months, and he didn't care. He was, and they're great. And they're so different. I mean, I think part of it is for Lewis, these are, as you and Austin noted, not exactly allegories, but these in that genre. And he's telling stories for children. Whereas Tolkien, I think, is writing in his mind history. He knows it's not exactly real, but I think he sees it. He's not. Lewis is trying to make a point to help people understand something about Jesus, whereas Tolkien's describing his inner life. He's describing this vast mental construct that he's made from the time he was a teenager up until, I mean, as Austin noted, he's writing some of those stories that end up in Silmarillion when he's in the First War, okay, when he's fighting in the war. And he doesn't finish them, and I forget when the last edition of it all, like 54, 56. So that's a long time that he's working on this, and it's this intricate thing. So I think that he when you read his biographies, he really wanted these things to be published, but he wanted to get it just right. So like he wrote, The Hobbit's published in 37. It's like 20 years later that they finally get the sequel. They asked him for the sequel almost immediately. So we're talking 37, 38. They want a sequel. And it takes him 20 years to get around to writing the thing that's already in his head. I mean, he changes it here and there. And you can see some of when you read some of the biographies, you can see some of the stuff where he changes his plans about, it's what was Frodo's first name, like Bongo or something like that. And he changes names and he changes passages and stuff like that. But it's like, I think it's already all there and he's describing something. So, I mean, some of it's his personality, but it's a different project, I think. Lewis has a specific goal. He's telling stories that are enjoyable and point to something bigger than themselves, whereas Tolkien is trying to recreate in the written word something that has this existence in his own mind. So lots of things going on there.
That compulsion that you're pointing to there, the need that Tolkien seems to have felt to write regardless, and the need he seems to have felt to get it perfectly right. When you read Leaf by Niggle, which is, as Austin pointed out, one of his more allegorical pieces of writing, it's autobiographical as well. And part of that story really centers around this guy wanting to paint this perfect picture of a tree, but he only ever got to painting one leaf. And it's almost, that's just such a poignant illustration, because if you think of all that Tolkien gave the world, all the languages, all the histories, all the beautiful epics and sagas, and then the more popular stories like The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, of all of that, he considers it just one leaf in the vast legend that he wanted to craft, that he wanted to sort of bring into existence and give the world. That's mind-boggling. It's stunning. First of all, it makes you think, because Leaf by Niggle goes into the afterlife, it makes you think, wow, what are we going to get to enjoy of Tolkien in the new heavens and new earth? Like when we no longer have a time limit on our creativity, what could possibly come of that? It's going to be awe-inspiring. But it also brings up this question of what exactly was happening with someone like Tolkien. So you look at it, and it's a masterpiece. His stuff it really feels kind of transcendent. It feels like it's from another place, and it feels as if it could have actually happened somehow. And maybe that's a bit of a fanboy talking, but there's an element of and Tolkien himself talked about this, of inspiration to it. And even a secular person would look at it and write a review and say something like, "The Lord of the Rings is an inspired work." They would say that, and what they mean by that is it's just notably excellent and obviously an instant classic. But Tolkien seemed to think that there was a little bit more going on, that he or other creative thinkers and artists could actually be receiving a providential gift of a story or of the beauty that he ends up recording in his stories. And I love the description that Austin gives of, and every artist who I've ever talked to sort of gives the same description, especially writers who are coming up with fictional scenarios and characters, how it's not so much that they're making it up, it's that they're tuning in and finding out what happened and meeting these characters as if they introduce themselves to the author, not that the author dreams them up as an act of will. And Lewis said something really similar to this, several things really similar, where he talks about how in the run up to writing the Chronicles of Narnia, so the first one being the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's the entrance into the series. He had this picture that had been stuck in his head for much of his life, really, and it came back to him again and again and again in the run up to Narnia, and it was this picture of a faun, a mythical, Greek creature. It's like a satyr in a snowy wood with parcels and an umbrella and like a lamp. And so this image, he starts asking himself, what could I make of this image? Could I actually craft out a story from it? And it happens. And then when he's describing the origin of Aslan, so Douglas Gresham in the Focus on the Family radio theater version, and you're sitting in Focus on the Family right now, so it's appropriate, right? But the radio theater versions of Narnia, Douglas Gresham, right, Lewis's stepson, he introduces each story, and he talks about how the origin of Aslan for Lewis was this moment of he had just been dreaming about lions a lot lately. Lions are all in his dreams. It's an image that he just keeps coming back to. He's a very visual person, right, Lewis? And all of a sudden, Aslan comes bounding in, fully formed and ready to go. It was like he didn't even have to think about that this character. He just materialized for him. That's very much the way Tolkien describes his creative process of almost like a modifying it until he correctly remembers what happened. As the way you talk about it. And I loved that Austin was able to sort of endorse that understanding while clearly distinguishing it from biblical revelation. Like, this is not the same process that's going on when you talk about the theonostas. Am I saying that right? Scriptures, right? The God-breathed scriptures. It's a different process, but God is still providentially at work in something like The Lord of the Rings. I think he's providentially at work in many of the great works of art in history, especially when when the authors and artists are so thoroughly committed to his service, as Tolkien was. So I'm open to that. I'm not dogmatic about it, but it definitely seems to me like God was at work in a very active and intentional way with Tolkien's life, certainly, but perhaps his work as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there with, clearly, as we said our last week, is things like scripture, prophecy in terms of scripture, it's a class by itself. It's a category by itself. Then, I think that we as Christians, we can be, most of us, even good Reformed people like us, are usually open to God leads people in certain ways. We get a little uncomfortable when the more specific that leading is someone's supposed to do, we get a little uncomfortable. And then, I do think that for many people who are not just artists, I think engineers sometimes talk about they have a dream and they wake up and it just fit. A fictional example is Back to the Future. Doc Brown, he has the image of the flex capacitor or whatever it was. I think that a lot of us who, like you and I, write a lot. People who are engineers, people or whatever, it just clicks all of a sudden, and you don't know how much of that is it's the subconscious and it's working and working and working all the time, and all of a sudden you become aware of it. It just clicks together, and how much of that is something remarkable, something extraordinary. And it does seem that something like that goes on, and it's hard to know how much of that is a genuine spiritual sort of supernatural sort of experience, or maybe supernatural is not the word. Maybe it is, as we are as human beings, spiritual and material, that there's a connection to something going on. We don't really know, but I think we all recognize something's going on there, particularly when we see a dramatic work of art or an amazing feat of engineering or something like that. There is an inspiration that's going on that isn't to the level of scripture, But it's okay to go from another literary genius here to borrow from Shakespeare. There are things more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. There are some odd things about this universe and about what it means to be a human being that we can't quite quantify. And I think as Westerners, it's really hard for us to deal with. But other people in the world, actually, an example when you were talking earlier, one example that came to me was there's a story is in a book called The Next Christendom. It's talking about the growth of the church around the world. And there was this moment, this had to be 30 years ago now. I may have mentioned this before in another context, but I think it was Anglican priests from East Asia were coming to somewhere in the North American Pacific Northwest. And the Anglos were showing this like a totem pole or whatever the name for that is. And the Anglos were all proud of it, all the cross-cultural sorts of things they're doing. And these priests from East Asia, Christian priests, they wanted to not exercise, but exorcise the spirits from this thing because they live in a world very different from a very mechanical world of the West. So it makes us uncomfortable. I think it makes other peoples in the world not so uncomfortable.
Yeah, in the modern world, we often talk of the muses, and we use that because we're referring back to an idea of how artists work, that it is a supernatural process. But we use it tongue in cheek. We use it as just purely as a metaphor for some natural process taking place. Like he's really in touch with the muses. He's got the creative juices flowing. We'll use a fluid metaphor like that. But there really is this recurring theme of artists throughout history who, especially in this Christian context, as the ones that really catch my attention for obvious reasons, who feel themselves inspired. The one that comes to mind, other than Tolkien immediately, is Handel when he's composing the Messiah, right? And he talks about being, we've done breakpoints on this, and he talks about being in this just white hot fury creatively, like it just wouldn't stop. Another one is Milton in the opening or the introduction in Paradise Lost. He talks about how he just kind of thanks God for just giving it to him. This is his self-understanding, right? And obviously there's things in Paradise Lost that many theologians and biblical scholars would look at and go, okay, John, you're really just, that's very apocryphal to you. That's your conception of things. And that's not really the biblical understanding of things. But nonetheless, he conceives of himself as receiving this somehow, or having been given the talent and the skill to put this out in record time. Just incredible. The verse just flowed and came to him, he said. And that's just something you see again and again. It's when you encounter a work like that, I imagine if you had listened to Handel's Messiah, you would have immediately known this is going to last. People are going to be singing this for centuries to come. If you had been there when Tolkien was putting the finishing touches on The Return of the King, you would have said, this is not going anywhere. This is actually going to stick around for a long time. People are going to call this a classic, because you would recognize what was in front of you. And it's easy to lose ourselves, I guess, in the recency of Tolkien, because it wasn't that long ago. I mean, Tolkien is within living memory of people who are still around. We can lose his work alongside these just dozens and dozens of imitators, even the good ones. Like I mentioned Robert Jordan a minute ago with the Wheel of Time series, all 14 books of it, which I finished two years ago. It's marvelous. It's really fun stuff. But do I think it will stand the test of time and sort of be looked back on centuries from now as a great literary work, as a classic of a genre? I don't think so. It'll still be remembered in some way, but like Harry Potter, that'll probably go away as well, or at least be looked back on as a nice kid's story from a particular era. But Tolkien will still be recognized as a part of that great canon. And it's interesting because we don't see a lot of obvious entries into that great artistic canon happening in our time. I really think it's slowed down. I think pop culture has probably suffocated a lot of that stuff. But there we go. That's clearly an entry in there, and thank God for it, because it's still moving people deeply spiritually. And as Austin said, I think this is true. I really do. That Tolkien's world of beauty and the enchantment of his world opens hearts to the possibility of the Christian story in a way that a bald presentation of the Christian story itself can't do. And I think Lewis's phrase was, it sneaks past the watchful dragons, guarding the imagination. And there really are watchful dragons, those materialist tendencies. I've got a book sitting on my desk right now, Bulwarks of Unbelief by Joseph Minnick, friend of mine, right? And it's about why atheism or unbelief feels so plausible. Not why people think it's plausible, but why they feel there's a certain obviousness to disenchantment of the world, to the lack of God in the world. And I think when you read Tolkien or you watch or listen to a really well adapted version of his work, you're struck between the eyes with the reality that there's got to be much more, because this is so beautiful and so resonant, and your heart just sings when you encounter it, that you must have been made for a better country, as Lewis might put it. If you find that desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, but something in Middle Earth satisfies, well, maybe you were made for something that looks a lot more like Middle Earth than your drab, material wasteland.
I think that there is something transcendent, and I think that's the key thing. When you see a great work of art, you're touching the transcendent. And our kind of end of the last battle, dwarvish personality wants to not be tricked. We want the material, the cynical thing. We read Tolkien, we read Lewis, we listen to Handel, we listen to whatever. We see a transcendent, and it makes us realize there's something more.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for joining me. I feel privileged, as you said in your notes, to talk about Tolkien for my day job. This is literally something we're doing. We're getting to sit here and just talk about The Lord of the Rings on a podcast. So yeah, thank you. And hey, man, I'm super glad you got to read this one too. And folks, if you want to check it out, I think this is a marvelously accessible book. It's one of those works of academic writing that's eminently accessible to the public. And if you love J.R.R. Tolkien, you love The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Silmarillion, the works that we referred to, you're going to want to check out Austin Freeman's Tolkien Dogmatics. Tim, thanks again.
As always, fun.